Sorry, I'll be ready in a second. I'm just waiting for the live stream to start, and then we can start. Okay, I'm good to start. We affirm our sole contention is 21st century Jim Crow. Davis explained that through the secret NSA program Marina, automatic summaries of individuals can be generated. He argued the NSA is hoarding vast quantities of metadata about millions of internet users, piecing together records of their social network uses, location, and other personal details. This year-long record of user data is gathered as part of a clandestine program called Marina. It uses browser tracking and build up automatic summaries of pattern of life activity and movement. The Marina is seen by SIGINT collection system. NSA was building complex models on U.S. citizens through a combination of metadata crunching and adding in less regulated third-party information. Military strength for law enforcement agencies and Homeland Security is in the breadth of its information. Kaoli indicates that this data is a part of the day-to-day law enforcement practices, as is acceptance of usage of NSA material for domestic and traditional law enforcement purposes. And the algorithmic technologies embedded in police have created a 21st century Jim Crow, as Hewitt explains, that is ebbed in the structure of policing into the state in much the same way that Jim Crow ebbed racial classifications. It says your body is the subject to invasion while courts excuse the violation of your rights. You are the subject of a carceral state which is just waiting to be cataloged. There are two impacts of 21st century Jim Crow. First, NSA law enforcement relationships mean data is used in routine policing duties. As Balko explains, that in information the NSA collects will be used by police to lock up ordinary Americans for routine crimes. The feds had these same arguments with police agencies all over the country, affecting thousands of cases. In fact, O'Donnell argues in 2019 that algorithms create feedback loops where predictive policing becomes more virulent in its racial bias over time. Predictive policing algorithms predispose police to collect more information from one region than another, but police presence in black communities is inherently deadly, as the Washington Post concludes that after a 6-year study on fatal shootings, it found in 2015 that there have been more than 5,000 shootings. Despite the unpredictable events that lead to fatal shootings, police have killed almost the same number of people annually, nearly 1,000. Second, pattern of life analysis uniquely targets peaceful protests, as DS wrote in 2020 that the surveillance of social media is a growing trend. Posts have landed individuals of color in unreliable gang databases and used to justify keeping them imprisoned. From protests to public housing, social media monitoring raises civil liberties and civil rights concerns that are currently going unaddressed. Unfortunately, access to data allows law enforcement to interrupt black movements, as Funk concludes in 2020 that using these technologies, authorities can interrupt organizing efforts and disrupt peaceful demonstrations before they begin. They can also identify, track, and even arrest protesters after they return home. Increased surveillance can discourage political expression online. Movements grounded in blackness are key to create structural change, as Perry concludes in 2020 that was demand through protests that spurred the quick arrest of police officer for George Floyd's murder, and it was prompted international corporations to invest billions in fighting racism and inequality. The country's rallies must continue if we expect substantive structural change, and juxtapose this against white movements like the women's suffrage movement that excluded black women, and the civil rights movement that embraced intersectionality and only promotes a promotion of blackness can bring visibility to issues that intersect with it. As Freeman argues in 2020 that the civil rights movement provided valuable lessons in social justice intersectionality. For progressive social justice movements, the civil rights movement utilized social justice intersectionality before it was a buzzword. It engaged in collaborations with women's rights and labor rights movements. Thus, the role of the ballot is that we must look at surveillance through the lens of blackness. Algorithms will always operate under the paradigm of whiteness. Affirming rejects the use of 21st century Jim Crow racial classification and centralizes discourse of surveillance around blackness. Brown finds that algorithms function under a logic of whiteness. This logic privileges users in relation to proximity to blackness. Reading the study of contemporary surveillance through the history of black enslavement and its attendant practice of captivity opens up the possibilities for fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and productive disruptions that happen when blackness enters the frame. And reversing this discourse is vital as status quo surveillance operates around the threat of perception, which justifies continued marginalization of people of color. As Weller concludes that in a democracy, there is a form of social contract at work which balances increased surveillance on its citizens with an expectation of state protection. State controls of information on citizens under the auspice of their welfare has been long used as a powerful justification for surveillance. In the West, greater media coverage of threats and moral panics in the public sphere paradoxically demanded both greater protection through increased state surveillance, at the same time greater liberty through legislation which allowed open access to information collections. For these reasons, we urge an AF ballot. And I'll send a speech doc.
Okay. We'll run prep once we have the speech doc here.
Okay, I just sent it.
Okay. I still haven't. Okay, I got it. I'll run prep. Okay, that was 40 seconds. It's going to start on like their roll of the ballot, and then I will read the neg case. Okay, is anyone not ready? Cool. On their roll of the ballot, first, if we win a stronger link into their advocacy, we should win the round because discourse involving solutions to their problem is critical to real change. The alternative roll of the ballot is to endorse the holistically best policy position. As Zanati 14 explains, options for resistance are not limited to rejection. Governmentality as a heuristic invites situated explorations and careful differentiations rather than overarching demonizations of power. Policy education is key to advocacy. That outweighs on portable skills. As Nixon 2000 explains, by getting into policy in a proactive manner, our demands can become law with real consequences. This requires struggles with bureaucracy, technical language, and resistance by decision makers. Policy work is a tool we can't ignore. This means you shouldn't vote for them on principle. In addition, our role of the ballot includes theirs, but also gives us offense, which is A, better on fairness because it gives us a path to the ballot too, and it's B, better on predictability because it means teams can like read arguments and still link in with our role of the ballot. Contention 1 is foreign surveillance. To end domestic surveillance, the NSA would also need to end foreign surveillance for two reasons. First, the surveillance web. As Bell 17 explains, American communications are inevitably caught up in the process of spying on foreigners. Non-target communications are 10 times more likely to be sucked up than target communications. Thus, ending domestic surveillance inherently requires ending international surveillance because there's always a risk the NSA picks up domestic data. Second, morale. Calls for restraint kill NSA morale. As Reed 13 explains, employees at the National Security Agency are feeling demoralized by the Snowden leaks. The NSA thinks it's providing some of the most valuable intelligence and that it deserves recognition for its efforts instead of calls for more restraint. Hits in morale have historically hurt the NSA's ability to collect intelligence. As Shane 17 explains, morale has plunged and experienced specialists are leaving the agency for better paying jobs. Trust has eroded. The number of new operations has declined. Subpoint A is Somalia. Drones are working to stop al-Shabaab in the status quo, as Canon 20 explains. The air campaign has hindered al-Shabaab's ability to communicate, so mistrust among members and restricted leaders' mobility. Drone strikes have resulted in al-Shabaab abandoning or losing territory. Canon concludes, U.S. drone strikes offer the only reliable check on al-Shabaab, thereby allowing the federal government of Somalia to continue functioning in Mogadishu, the Somali capital. These drones rely on the NSA, as Brickerhoff 14 explains. Before the United States launches a drone strike on a terrorist threat, it relies solely on the NSA to tell drone operators where someone is located based on data intercepted from their cell phone. The impact is famine, as al-Shabaab historically denies food aid. As Burke 17 explains, anyone found bringing food aid will be killed because of suspicion that aid agencies might be affiliated to the Somali government. Food aid is urgent, as the International Rescue Commission in 2020 finds 5 million people could be plunged into famine as desert rotists ravage crops across the Horn in East Africa. Subpoint B is Israel. As Stein 14 explains, Washington's relationship towards Israel is heavily influenced by its cooperation in intelligence operations against Iran. The NSA has significantly increased the assistance it provides to its Israeli counterpart. This reliance cannot be understated. As Freelich 17 explains, Washington is the sole port of call for strategic consolation. Even a marginal change would have profound ramifications for Israeli national security. Less intelligence means a greater risk of miscalculation. As Young 19 explains, Israel's decision to strike or not to strike Iran depends in large part on perceptions about Iran's strength and intentions. If faulty intelligence leads Israel to believe Iran intends to use a nuclear weapon against Israel, Israel will carry out an airstrike on nuclear facilities. That escalation will be devastating, as Terse 13 explains. An Israeli attack on Tehran would kill 7 million people. Contention 3 is offshoring. NSA surveillance has boosted the development of data centers abroad. As DNS 13 explains, U.S. companies are seeking refuge overseas to protect their data. Silicon Valley is not immune to revelations about widespread surveillance by the NSA. Indeed, damaging information about NSA tactics is spurring an IT renaissance in several countries. For instance, Brazil and India citizens as well, as companies are unnerved by the revelations of spying. This has continued today, as Ang 20 explains. Growth in cloud services is showing no signs of slowing down. Yet by 2025, the U.S. portion of cloud storage will drop from 51% to 31%. Companies have every reason to come back due to the high cost of keeping foreign data. As DNS 13 explains, the Valley is bracing for losses in the range of $35 billion in annual revenue because they are seeking storage of their data elsewhere. The impact is recovery. As Miller 20 explains, the world's largest investors are focused on the market for digital infrastructure. Interest has been boosted by the growth of AI and 5G. Supporting digital FDI can bring technology, know-how, jobs, and growth. Any delay to the recovery is devastating, as the World Bank in 2020 quantifies. The pandemic is estimated to push an additional 88 million people into extreme poverty this year. To reverse this, countries will need capital innovation. I will send the doc. Okay, the doc is sent.
I think I just got it.
I haven't gotten it yet. Sorry. Okay, I just got it. I'm good to start.
Okay.
All right, can I have the first question? Since our role of the ballot is centering this debate around blackness, how do you link in?
Well, we read an alternative roll of the ballot, so we don't agree with your roll of the ballot.
Why? Out of curiosity.
Because
Can you
our
explain the
our
merits?
evidence, like our alternative roll of the ballot, is to endorse the best holistic policy position.
Right, and we say that's always excluding black people. So you're saying excluding black people and having the discourse around black people in a debate setting is better than talking
No,
about it.
no. Our argument is that like having policy positions that like take into account all impacts of policies leads to better real world portable skills which can combat oppression like outside of the debate space.
Right, I
That's like
understand.
why our
That's
argument
another
outweighs
way
on
of saying
portable skills.
utilitarianism. correct, right?
I mean,
A util
not
for, like,
really, because like our argument is that we develop more portable skills to combat the oppression you talk about.
how? Like,
Moreover, like we're going to read
Wait.
turns and link-ins from our impacts into your impacts, right? So like we are going to be accessing your impacts and the for us because we are endorsing the best policy decision solving for the oppressive structures that you talk about.
Okay, so on your argument about protests, so like was the NSA able to disrupt the Black Lives Matter protests this summer?
yeah, the data the NSA gave went to like law enforcement so they can infiltrate protests.
So, but what was the impact of that? Because your own evidence says like billions were dumped into racial justice funds.
Right, just because like there's protests seem like some success, we're saying that you haven't solved back for like creating structural change because you're still suppressing protests.
I mean, like, so like, is your argument that without NSA protests, like more cities would have defunded the police and more structural like change would
Yeah,
have
you have
occurred?
to have more widespread change.
Okay, but like, what does that widespread change look like?
Like more structural change, like such like as defunding police and like investing more in like racial justice and discrimination.
Okay,
I have a question.
sure.
Why can't the NSA just sort the data that they like get from like international and national data?
Because they A, don't have the technology to do it, and B, even if they can sort it, like the fact that they've already picked up the data and surveilled it, like if they like look at the data and be like, oh, this is an American citizen, we shouldn't look at it, they've still violated the resolution.
Okay, but like even if they don't look at it, before they look at it, they just see it's an American citizen and sort it and like get rid of it. How come they can't like have international surveillance?
Sure. So A, like they don't have the technology to physically sort it. They don't know where the data came from. Additionally, there's always the like
I mean, they
risk
did the
that
surveillance. Why don't they know where it came from?
because like you can't immediately tell like where the data is from, where someone like what someone's nationality is just based on their
I
data.
mean,
So
isn't
there's
that the point
always
of
a risk.
surveillance?
Yeah, the point of the surveillance is to collect as much data as possible. That's exactly our argument. It's that they can't separate what's domestic and what's international. So if you affirm and end domestic surveillance, you also have to end international surveillance because collecting foreign data would be illegal under the resolution.
Okay.
We only got like 5 seconds left.
All right, I'm good.
All right. I think Mila will take a tiny bit of prep. Give me a sec to call her. Okay, we're gonna start now. All right, I'm done. That was exactly 40 seconds. It's just going to be the right of the ballot and then their case. Is everyone good? Okay, give me a sec to pull this up. Okay. Oh, sorry. Actually, I just realized it's going to be an overview actually at the top of case, like just extending the role of the ballot kind of. I don't.
Is it like should I get another sheet or is it just like
No, it's not anything like you can flow at the top of your case. It's like a weighing overview. But I'll answer the role of the ballot first, then go into their case and read the overview and stuff. All right. On your role of the ballot, they say if they link it to our advocacy, they can solve. There's two big problems here. First, in the world, if we win a racist, this NSA's and a collection of the surveillance and the use of algorithms are uniquely racist, that's enough to reject the system. It doesn't matter if they prove that they can somehow link in and like somehow solve to help Black people. If we tell you that we're dismantling a racist structure in the United States, that's enough to reject it. But secondly, remember the fact that they always ignore the majority. When you always prioritize these high magnitude impacts that somehow might, in some way, shape, or form, somehow link it to Black people, you can always ignore the actual structures that are in place that are always going to hurt Black people. They can see the brown nose. It says that surveillance is always seen through the lens of whiteness, which has allowed these problems to fester for years and no reforms have ever been made. The only way you can actually make reforms by rejecting the NSA surveillance since it's uniquely bad. They say their interpretation is better for A, fairness, and B, predictability. The problem is A, surveillance isn't in favor of black people. It's always disproportionately hurting them. But B, unpredictability, this argument doesn't make sense. Or they can just read why surveillance is good. If they can't prove that, they should lose the round. Let's go on to their case. Start with an overview. There are structures in place that make the black oppression inevitable, which is why the black needs to put at the forefront of the debate. The negative team is saying to forego over 400 years of structural racism because the economy could be hurt or poverty may increase, but black people have facing a pandemic every time we walk out the door, and 3 times more likely to be killed by police. We have a moral obligation to view this round through the lens of blackness, and so far the NSA with surveillance was built to surveil folks and entrench negative harms with Jim Crow classification. That's Brown and who rejecting racial classification that exists within NSA surveillance that constantly justify marginalizing black people. That's also Weller. On their first contest on foreign surveillance, first on data separation, they say the NSA can't automatically filter foreign and domestic data now, but that doesn't mean that A, it's impossible, or B, that we couldn't just manually destroy the domestic data in the world of the affirmative. This is empirically proven because there's already restrictions on domestic data and the NSA metadata collection already violates. In those instances, either A, companies filter, as Gallagher 18 explains, that within AT&T's network storage filtering equipment designed to separate foreign and domestic internet data before it's passed on to the NSA, or B, the NSA filters it, as Lemon 14 furthers, that after foreign intelligence is required, it must be analyzed to remove or mask certain protected categories of information. The NSA has multiple layers and checks in place to prevent further areas of intelligence gathering. This prefer argument for 3 reasons. A, no actions and incentives to disband the NSA. Anyone that did so would be called a protest and lose their job immediately. But B, people in the NSA have an interest in keeping their jobs because so they find a workaround. But C, we tell you if data is gathered and deleted before they even look at it, that's not surveillance in the first place. But secondly, specifically on morale, they say that people in the NSA like get mad. This doesn't make any sense. Just because you feel bad for being exposed, that doesn't mean that end foreign surveillance. Their impact is literally just that a couple people left their jobs to go to private companies. That's not the same thing as them totally ending foreign surveillance. But specifically on Somalia, a couple responses. First, American journalists used to subjugate black bodies abroad, just like surveillance does domestically. As Paley explains last year, the U.S. military has inflicted some of the most grotesque forms of violence on Africans under the pretext of protecting Americans. American shadow wars in Africa have fought covertly and violent international law. The highly secret operations, which rely on drones, renders them invisible to the American citizen, but the security needs of the United States make manifest a desire to control territories far away. So to protect the black bodies to a mission and in many cases to annihilate them. But secondly, we tell you these drones aren't even working, as Hansen indicated in 2019 that in the case of Somalia illustrates that there's a limitation to the strategy. Intensified drone strikes in Somalia have not created anything close to a strategic advantage against the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. In fact, you can turn these drone strikes have only intensified the responses. Burkhardt in 2019 that they have warned that Al-Shabaab was planning another terrorist attack on to attract media attention. Kristen furthers in 2019 this foreign policy failure in progress. Rather than expand U.S. military intervention in Somalia should be shut down before it sprouts into another needless conflict. On Israel, a couple responses. First, we tell you that this argument is silly. They just say that there's faulty intelligence. The problem is that even if they get faulty intelligence, it's actually better to end domestic surveillance because then there's a much better chance the intelligence that Israel gets is a lot better. But secondly, we would just tell you that Biden sells for tension with diplomacy. As Times reports that Biden will strictly lift other sanctions on Iran's nuclear problem to restart diplomacy with Iran. That sells better, as Hagan furthers last November that Biden will revive U.S.-Iran diplomacy. History has shown that the direction of tension between the U.S. and Iran have occurred more often under reformist and pragmatic administrations such as Rouhani's. But thirdly, we just also tell you that their evidence indicates that we should have already had a strike like last November. In the world, there's really no brilliant for when a strike will actually happen. You opt for the more probable impact, which is actually protecting black people in the status quo. On offshore, a couple responses. First, we don't store data like that anymore. Everyone just uses the cloud, and 4 American companies dominate. As Camarano 20 explains, that most businesses run on cloud-based services, but massive infrastructure is almost entirely in the hand of 4 U.S. companies: Amazon, IBM, Microsoft, and Google. Before our argument on recency, all their evidence is like from 2014, before everyone started using things like Dropbox. There's no reason why they offshore data centers if they store their data on the cloud. But secondly, offshoring doesn't make it safe. There's no link. As Edgar explained in 2015, that shifting user bases abroad is a poor way to combat American surveillance because niches survey them internationally. But thirdly, we tell you, even if they win that data is being stored abroad, it doesn't go to developing nations. It's just going to wealthy European nations. Their DNS evidence literally talks about how European nations wanted their data stored separately from the United States, not developing nations. Don't try and let them conflate like Europe and like Brazil with all the developing world. That's probably problematic, but also just doesn't win them a link. I'll send a speech talk.
All right, we will run prep once we've got it.
Yeah.
Are y'all running prep now or waiting to the speech talk?
No, we're not. We're not doing anything.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just removing some code I didn't read. It should be sending like a sec. Okay. It should have just sent. Tell me when y'all get it.
All right, we will run prep once we've got it.
Yep.
All right, I got it. We'll run prep. All right, stop prep. That was a minute 13 plus the like 30, so a minute 45 there total.
I'll send the doc after the speech. So it's going to be, I'm going to mute myself. So it's going to be the roll of the ballot we read, the overview that Anthony read, and then our case, their case. Okay. On our roll of the ballot, if we win which link is like the best to create real critical change to the oppression that they talk about, we should win the round. They say that if the NSA is racist, we should still reject it. Our argument is that the NSA isn't racist and is good to fight racism. Those are the arguments we'll make on their side. Then they say that we're ignoring structures of oppression. We're not ignoring structures of oppression. We're actively engaging in the clash to find the best policy action to address the oppression that they talk about. They say that surveillance isn't fair. That's fine, but they've conceded the next Nixon evidence, which says that policy discourse can actually create like support for real change and educate us on how to create change in our real lives into the future. So by talking about which policy position is the best, that is the best way to address oppression in the real world. On the weighing, they say that white people ignore blackness through probability. Our intent is to not ignore that blackness by addressing and clashing with the oppressive arguments. We solve for all this weighing and access their impacts. You can extend that foreign surveillance doesn't happen. We're going for a C2. They say that businesses use the cloud. That's the entire point. Data centers are the makeup of the cloud. You need servers to like do computing in the cloud. Then they say that it doesn't work because like to avoid NSA surveillance. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work. Consumers perceptually believe that their data is more safe if it's abroad than if it's in the United States from the NSA. That's why companies are actively doing it in the status quo. Then they say that it doesn't go to the developing world. The DNS evidence says it spurred an IT renaissance in India and Brazil. Also, it's Western data, but developing world jobs and infrastructure because the servers are literally being built in these places. It's causing massive amounts of infrastructure and FDI. Let's go to their side. First off, our impacts on the C2 link in. Slow growth and poverty causes massive scapegoating, causing more racism. Shramo 7 writes that slow growth breeds distrust and hate. Some of the worst periods of intolerance towards African Americans and immigrants occurred during periods of slow or negative growth. The worst example was Nazism following hyperinflation and stagnant growth. Second, you can turn it. Mass surveillance is the least discriminatory. Hajithamu 14 writes that untargeted surveillance, such as blanket screening, neither single people out nor convey suspicion, and thus stigmatizes none in particular. Third, you can turn it because digital surveillance removes biased human perception. Simon 14 writes that electronic mechanisms address the danger that surveillance will reflect cognitive bias. Blacks burdened by stop and frisk are more tractable with electronic surveillance. Go to the first impact about predictive policing. First, you can turn it. The more data the systems have, the less biased they become. Garcia 20 writes that to solve the bias, algorithms need to be supplied a more diverse set of faces to learn from. Using that method, there will be no bias in facial recognition AI 3 years from now. Second, it's non-unique. Predictive policing will happen regardless of digital models. Siegel 18 writes that even before predictive models, the practice of considering a suspect's conviction history would have contributed contributed to the same kind of cyclical perpetual of the African-American population. Empirically, Brantingham 18 writes that there's no significant difference in the arrest proportions of minority individuals between control conditions and predictive policing. For further evidence, it's a multi-year empirical study of the LAPD. Third, it's non-unique. Private sector companies can supply predictive technologies. Winston 18 writes that New Orleans allows Palantir to use its law enforcement records of court filings and social media data to train its software for crime forecasting. Palantir also provides analysts with the LA police. On the second impact about protests, first, surveillance doesn't prevent dissent. Sagar 15 writes that surveillance did not prevent the end of segregation or retreat from Vietnam. Movements that have public opinion are not intimidated by state surveillance empirically with Black Lives Matter. Second, encryption solves. Hammacher 20 writes that Black Lives Matter has adopted encrypted messages to hide their phone number and communicate more privately. Third, you can turn it. Surveillance stops extremist movements. Sagar 15 writes that surveillance may make it harder for individuals to associate with extremist groups such as neo-Nazis and anarchists that are actively fighting against stuff like Black Lives Matter. Fourth, you can turn it because the NSA stops terrorism. Lewis 14 writes the NSA surveillance is working to assemble fragments of data from many sources into a coherent picture. Broad surveillance of communications is most effective method for discovering terrorist activity. That's also for alt-right extremism. Kurzman 15 writes that right-wing policies are increasingly worried about law enforcement. Anti-government extremism is the leading source of ideological violence in America. Fifth, the NSA doesn't look at phone data anymore. Holmes 20 writes that the NSA program of collecting metadata was discontinued in 2015. That means that movements like Black Lives Matter can just use their phones to communicate and they can't be spied on by the NSA. Yeah, I'll send the doc. I just didn't read a card or two, so I need to cut them out. Okay, it should be sent.
I think I just got it. Give me like 2 seconds. I think me and Lauren are gonna take a little bit of prep. We've used 40 total, so we have 220 left. We're gonna start. Let me pull this up. Okay, we're gonna start now. All right, we're stopping prep. That was 50 seconds, so we have 130 left. I cannot do math. I think or 140. Or wait, no, that means we've used 130, I think.
I'm not great at math either.
Yeah, I actually need to add this up. Wait. We use 40 plus 50. That's 90. Yeah, okay, we have 130 left.
Okay, cool.
Right. Can I have first question?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So let me start a timer and then we'll be good. All right. So let's start on surveillance, right?
Mhm.
You tell me that over time surveillance gets like less racist. I guess
Yeah.
my question for you is, if you're over policing black neighborhoods and you're getting constant data about like why like these black neighborhoods are bad because like they do more crime here, how do they become less racist over time?
Because you start collecting data from more diverse areas and
Wait, but
more
are they doing
areas
that?
that are
Are they
less
doing that right
targeted.
now though?
Our evidence indicates that within 3 years there won't be any bias. So there are doing things like this.
Like
Moreover,
the NSA specifically is going to collect data from like white neighborhoods now.
like, okay, we might like the evidence indicates that they are doing things to improve the surveillance of facial recognition. We do have evidence that says that the NSA is hiring more African American and minority individuals, right? The head of the Pentagon is now African American. They're hiring more students from historically black colleges. Those
But how does that
students and
solve for
those people
systematic racism? It's like, okay,
are
the
going to
NSA
be
hires me,
solving.
so like I just end the NSA's racist algorithms. Like that doesn't
Well,
make any sense.
the point is that as more broad people get into the area and as people refine the systems to be less biased, they become less biased. Like it's like technology, right? We will do things like not target historically black neighborhoods like in a unjust way. We will reform those things and make the algorithms less biased over time.
Okay, sure. You have a question?
So like we can probably agree that like local police are racist, right?
Yeah.
So if local police are giving a lot of their surveillance to the NSA, if we win that the NSA is less racist than local police, isn't that a good thing?
No, because the NSA, first of all, like there's no evidence you read that says the NSA is somehow better. We do a lot of evidence saying the NSA's algorithms are constantly becoming more racist over time. But secondly, we tell you that since the NSA is giving racist data to racist police, it allows the racist police to target black people. When you end the NSA surveillance and the racist police officers no longer have this data saying, hey, Anthony lives over here, you should go target him, there's literally no way for them to like target me, so they can't be as racist. Can I have a question?
Okay. Like obviously our arguments are all of the arguments I read in Rebuttal, but
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
sure
sure.
you can. I mean,
So on the roll of the ballot, I guess, like you say that like just making good policies is key. I guess just my question is like, how does somehow growth in the developing world like end like help end these structures of oppression that are oppressing black people like in the US?
well, one, growth like from multiple countries also spreads to the United States. But moreover, they can also be mass structural racism against people of African descent in other countries, right? Like there can be mass
So
structural
rather than
violence
like
against
so rather than
African
end like an
Brazilian people.
actual structure, you're like, oh, but like poverty is pretty bad, I guess. Okay.
Nah, like the evidence that I read at the top of your case says that in times of slow growth and economic decline, people scapegoat other minority individuals, and thus that causes the
Well,
structures of oppression that you
they're already
talk about.
scapegoated the status quo. Like I don't understand how much worse it gets if you like
I mean, I
rather than
would
ending
say,
the racist system that's promoting that in the first place. But I think that's
yeah,
crossed anyway. Um, we have 1:30 left. I think we're gonna take more prep. Give me a sec to start my timer. Okay, hold up. All right, we're gonna start now.
Okay, it's gonna go our case, their case. Yeah, I'm just gonna go our case, and at the bottom I'll do the roll of the ballot. Okay. Starting off our case, the NSA uses Marina to collect info on individuals which are given to police for predictive policing, which creates a feedback loop that leads to black people being targeted by police. That's Davis and who. We're going for our first look at predictive policing. It tells you that NSA algorithms are over police black neighborhoods, which results in 1,000 black people being shot by police annually. This is the only way you can end this is through NSA surveillance. That's the Washington Post. But they give you a few responses. First, they tell you that, economic growth means, bad economy leads to more oppression. First, economic growth it's not the same thing as dismantling a racist structure like the NSA. But then second, they say you can turn it. You can group their two terms about algorithms being good. First, the status quo disproves this. Literally, our David argument tells you this is bad. But then second, their evidence is about the AI and facial recognition. Our evidence is about Marina. It's not the same thing. But then third, O'Donnell tells you that it actually creates algorithms create feedback loops, making it worse over time. That's why you haven't seen anything getting better in the last 5 years. They're only getting worse. But then they give you this other turn. The fourth turn they use is that more data means less bias. But fourth, Bolko tells you the predictive policing is only increasing because these algorithms are inherently racist and going and leading to more black people being shot at by police and leading to police encounters. But then the fourth, they give you a non-unique saying it's going to happen no matter what. We say, no, the only way to end this is ending the NSA, ending domestic surveillance, which is the best way to solve. But then they say private corporations can solve, can fill in. The only examples they give you 2 police departments. We tell you when you end NSA domestic surveillance, you end it nationally across the board. But then go into our second link. We're not going to go for it, but you can. We'll tell you that encryption solves. We can group to who turns together. First, we tell you the NSA doesn't solve for terrorism because it only supports white supremacy and only entrenches it. It doesn't actually solve back for the root cause. But then second, if you allow them to do surveillance on terrorism, they can still survey black people under the guise of having it being about terrorism, which means that you're only going to see more black people being hurt. Let's go into this roll of the ballot. They don't link in it. They don't answer it well at all. We tell you that first, the only way you can end this is actually framing the debate in the role of blackness. At the point where they don't do that, they just try to have a turns against it. They don't actually win it. The only way to actually solve back for this and to affirm is to dismantle the NSA, which is the best way, the only way you can affirm. But then they tell you that we don't answer their Nixon card about policy is the best way to have real structural change. At the point where they don't have any policy that's making structural change in their case, they can't actually solve back. The only thing the card they miss is about Brown, which tells you that when you have surveillance in their world, it's always inherently under the pretense of being white, which is that you're always going to have it justifying oppression against black people. Let's go into their side of the case. You can extend the overview because they still are ignoring blackness by the point where they aren't actually solving for structural racism or change or viewing the debate in the lens of blackness. The only way to actually solve back for this is going to be to affirming. Let's go into their contention about offshoring. There's a few responses. First, we say they say data collections are businesses. That's the point. No, the point is that Anthony gives you in rebuttal is that data collections are actually online. They're just clouds. They're not actually physical data centers that are happening in other countries. That's why their second card that Anthony tells you is that these countries, the second response they just give you is that IT is going to happen in India and Brazil. That proves our point. At the point where these are only going to countries that are having a good markets like India and Brazil, they're not going to these developing countries that actually need it. This is why they tell you that their card says that Europe wants to be separate from these developing countries. It means you're actually not going to see any developing growth. At the point where they don't extend any kind of impact and rebuttal, you can't even extend extend the economy into their case. This is why you're always going to prefer our side of the flow because you're going to be dismantling structural racism first before anything else.
Oh, we'll run prep. right, stop prep. That was all of it. It's gonna go like the overview on our case, then our case, C3 Wayne, their case, roll the ballot. Is everyone ready? Actually, I'll talk about the roll of the ballot before getting into their case, but I will signpost along the way.
Sorry, can you just give the very top of the order again?
Okay, the overview that they've put on our case.
Got it.
First.
All good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep, of course. Okay, anyone not ready? Let me myself in Discord. Okay. On our overview, their overview, they said that we ignore blackness. No, we don't. We're not ignoring. Our intent is not to ignore blackness. We have implicated every argument to the oppressive structures that they talk about. Go to our argument on data centers. It's where we're winning the round. The DNS evidence says that the perception of enabling spying by the NSA has driven companies to offshore data because people perceive that their data is more secure overseas than it is in the United States. And the DNS evidence says that without NSA surveillance, they have every reason to come back to the United States because it costs $35 billion more to keep their data, stored in like places like Brazil and India than in the United States. The impact is the recovery from the pandemic because the Miller evidence says that investors are focused on data centers because they bring technology, know-how, jobs, and growth, which the World Bank evidence says can bring 83 million people out of poverty. They say that the data collection only happens in the cloud, but the cloud doesn't just exist. You need physical servers and like routers to run the cloud, which are being built in the developing world. The cloud isn't just like willed into existence. You still need physical servers in order for it to exist. That's exactly our argument. They say that it's only going to places like Brazil and India. Brazil and India are the developing world, and the jobs and growth that in like investment that comes in inherently it helps the poorest of the poor because it like brings jobs, it brings like construction jobs, which helps the 83 million people. That's the World Bank evidence. This outweighs for two reasons. First, it outweighs on probability. Data centers are abroad in the status quo. The neg is the status quo. We are defending the status quo, which means we are 100% probable. Their impacts are projections of what could happen, whereas all we need to say is that the status quo is good. The second is on the Lincoln. It's the overview on their side. The Schramm evidence says that the worst periods of intolerance have been a result of slow growth. They say that economic growth is not the same as dismantling a structure, but we say creating a new structure of oppression is just as bad as dismantling an old one. This outweighs their case for two reasons. First, it outweighs on scope because it affects the entire world, not just the United States. It affects like indigenous populations and African populations in the developing world. And secondly, it outweighs on probability because it's historical. Our Schramm evidence says that the worst periods of intolerance historically have occurred in times of slow growth, whereas their case is a projection of what could happen when we end the NSA, which is an unproven scenario, which means if you think we're winning a link into poverty in the developing world, we're also winning a link into their roll of the ballot, on their roll of the ballot. They say we haven't effectively framed the round in blackness. We have. We've implicated every single one of our arguments to the oppressive structures that they talk about, which means we probably still win under their framing because of the Lincoln that I just talked about. But you can extend the Nixon evidence that policy discourse creates real world change. They say that we don't defend a policy that can create real world change. Yeah, we do. We say that data centers prevent like this stagnation, which prevents bad growth. And also we say that like nothing happens if the resolution occurs. But we're saying that like defending the resolution as a whole concept creates portable skills, which creates real world change. So even if you don't believe we're defending a specific topic, we're still defending specific portable skills, which triggers the roll of the ballot. Extend the Brandingham evidence on their side. There is no arrest difference between predictive policing and non-predictive policing. They say that we give data to racist police officers so they can predictive police, but our evidence says even without those algorithms, there's absolutely zero difference in arrest records because racist police will still like just do it. But the Simon evidence says it can address cognitive bias. So without the data, police officers are still going to be racist. Remember, zero difference in arrest records. But with the NSA data, it's at least a little bit better because the computers aren't racist, whereas individuals are.
You good for Grand?
Yep.
All right. Can I have first question?
Mm-hmm.
So you tell me first that like they're building these data centers in India and in Brazil specifically, and like in Europe, and then you tell me like you link in because
they're not building them in Europe.
I mean your card like says Europe like 50 times.
No,
like
the evidence, yeah, European people's data is being stored in like Brazil and India. That's not where the servers are being built, though.
My question is simply like, how are you helping people in Africa? Like you say multiple times, like we're spilling over growth to like countries in Africa. We're like helping Black people. Like they're not building the data centers there. So how?
I.e., like Black minorities in Brazil or Black minorities in India.
So rather
or
than
like
directly dismantling the NSA's racist systems for Black people in America, we're gonna help the Black people that might be in Brazil that are affected by like the growth. Like
it's the
what?
Yeah, it's the weighing that I did on the Lincoln that it outweighs on like scope and probability.
Okay, let's talk about this Lincoln, right? Because you're saying your Lincoln is gonna somehow better solve back for dismantling a racial, like a racist structure and a racist government program because it helps the economy.
No, the
Like
argument
this
is
sounds
that
kind of silly. Like right, like you're saying,
not
oh,
silly.
new system is worse, right? But we haven't had a new system. We've had the same racist system
Well,
for 400 years.
What
And
what
you're
we're
saying that
saying,
growth
what we're
is
saying,
going to solve for racist system. Like US has had growth for
no,
like
the argument
many
is that
years.
what we're saying is that in the status quo, right, there's decreasing growth because of things like coronavirus.
Right.
Historically, that has caused some of the greatest periods of intolerance towards minority groups in the countries across the globe, right? Large movements like the Nazi movement were started off of periods of low growth. We reverse that low growth, which means that you are seeing less oppressive structures against the Black minorities living in places like Brazil and India.
Okay, but you're not solving any minorities in the US.
No,
Yeah,
like
I
I,
mean,
I guess
the
my
gr-
question is like are there Nazis in like Brazil and India? Like I just don't understand like
Yes.
why like
there are like, yeah, like
Yeah.
one, there are Nazis in Brazil and India, but two, there are extremely racist people that will scapegoat
Okay,
other minority groups in those countries.
but we're not
so
focusing
like
on the
so
US
if you
basically.
so if you give like money, it's like you create jobs in like Brazil and India,
Mhm.
which makes the Nazis just not hate black people in Brazil and
Well,
India.
it's like the
Like I
not
just
okay.
it's like a
Like you
statistical
have
like correlation. Like you're not directly solving for the issue. You're just
yeah,
saying like
no.
oh,
But our argument is that if we prevent the creation of a new structure of oppression that
but
is
you're not
just as good
creating a
as
new
disman,
structure.
we're preventing the creation of a new
No,
structure of
you're
oppression.
not.
That's the argument.
That's
Yeah, it
what
is because like
How can you
the
create
slow
how can you prevent
downturn has created some of the worst periods of like
Because
structures of oppression.
people
I'm just confused with how
scapegoat-
you're just or how you're preventing the creation of a new structure when
Because-
there isn't a new structure being created. It's just dismantling an
yeah,
old
there,
structure.
there isn't a new structure being created because the status quo is good and we're the next. The argument is that without the data centers and without this recovery to the pandemic, we would have like millions of people, additional people in poverty, which historically, when millions of people go into poverty, that creates like the worst periods of hate and like oppression in history.
I think that's time.
Okay. I don't think we have prep left. It's gonna be our case, the roll the ballot, the overview, and then their case. Just give me a sec to pull up this doc. Okay. Sorry. All right. Start in our case, the NSA uses Marina to collect info on individuals which are given to police for predictive policing, which contain constant feedback with the least of black people being targeted police. That's Davies and Hugh. We're going for our first thing on predictive policing. The NSA algorithms over police black neighborhoods, which results in 1,000 black people being shot by police annually. This only ends when you end NSA surveillance. Let's look at their responses. They give you two responses. First, they just say that in the world that there's like no statistical difference. Basically, the problem is they miss the Washington Post evidence, which says that unless you actually dismantle the NSA surveillance and you stop constantly sending police to black neighborhoods, you're never going to see the decrease. They just say there's no statistical difference. The problem is this is just looking at things like arrest records, which isn't the same as you constantly sending police to black neighborhoods, which increases the rate that you're encountering police officers, which inherently is going to increase the rate at which you're being shot. Our evidence is just a lot better on this. But secondly, they just say that the NSA's data is better. The problem is they miss the O'Donnell evidence. I can see it in every single speech, which says that the NSA constantly creates these feedback loops because when you constantly over police certain neighborhoods, you constantly get more data on those neighborhoods, which leads you even sending even more police, which means the systems just get more and more racist over time. And you're never actually solving for the problem. On the roll of the ballots, they just say that like we're actively engaging by a negative system of oppression. The problem is even if they win, this like slow growth thing is like kind of bad. It's not the same as inherently dismantling a racist system in the United States. Because in the world that we always prioritize growth in every single round, we always prioritize growth. The US is always trying to increase growth around the world. We're never dismantling things like structural racism, so always going to inherently hurt black people. That's why you prefer our case. But then they say that discourse is key. The problem is they're not giving you any sort of reason why how they're actually actively helping black people. They just say that they're pulling black people out of poverty. That's not in any way, shape, or form similar to ending structural system of racism that are hurting black people. But then they say they're addressing the oppression. No, they're not. By impacting out to poverty, this is conceded or like you always part of these high magnitude impacts while actually leaving black people worse off. Let's go into their case. Even if you believe all this stuff, they're not even winning their case in the first place for two reasons. First, and remember that the data collection is like through the cloud. The cloud centers, like even if they're like abroad or like domestically, it doesn't really matter because it's stored in the cloud. You're not actually helping these people in the developing world. But second, remember the fact that the data isn't like the developing world isn't being helped. They just say that India and Brazil are the only two countries that they're helping. There's no single way like somehow you help black people in India, Brazil, that's going to outweigh dismantling a racist system of structure of oppression in the United States versus maybe you help some black people in India, Brazil get some jobs and pull them out of poverty. The weighing is just a lot better on our side. We actually know we're solving for structural change. You vote F.
Okay, it's going to be my case. It's going to be my case, the Lincoln, the roll of the ballot, and the framing just all together, and then their case. Okay. Extend our argument about offshoring. Fears of NSA surveillance have meant that big tech companies are offshoring their data centers that store people in the United States data from the United States to other countries because people are paranoid that they're being spied on. The ANG evidence finds that decrease from the United States to the developing world has continued to 2020. The Miller evidence finds that this infrastructure brings technology, jobs, and growth to the developing world, and the World Bank finds that pulls millions out of poverty. They say the businesses use the cloud, not physical centers. They continuously concede the front line that you need physical servers to have data on the cloud. That's literally what the cloud is. You need places to store the data and actually have people's files uploaded onto a computer if you upload them to Google Docs. They say it's only India and Brazil. Those people are in the developing world. It helps the poorest people because it provides them with things like construction jobs and trickle-down economics. They say that we don't frame it in blackness. We have with the Shram Lincoln. The worst periods of intolerance around the world have relied on scapegoating of minorities because of their economic harms. They scapegoat minority individuals. They say we're not dismantling a structure of oppression. They have not given you a reason why dismantling a structure for oppression is any worse than creating a new structure of oppression, which is what happens if you allow massive scapegoating of minority individuals. They say that magnitude is bad, but we also solve for the small issues of genocidal structural violence occurring in these countries. They've also conceded all of the weighing. First on scope, we access the entire world, African Brazilians, African Indians, and all of the other minorities around the world. They access one minority group. And on probability, this is the worst periods of historical tolerance in the world. We have mass historical precedent. They've conceded both of those weighing mechanisms, which should make the round pretty easy for you, but you can also extend defense on their side. The Brantingham evidence finds that there's no arrest differences between conventional policing and digital NSA. They just say that we need to stop police from going to Black neighborhoods, but our evidence is a statistical analysis that says that they go to those Black neighborhoods no matter what. The only difference is that the Simon evidence says that you can address the cognitive bias of police through the NSA. They say that the NSA is racist, but it's less racist than having the cops decide what neighborhoods to go to.
Good round.
Good round.
And thank
Yeah,
you
good
all
round.
for judging.
Good
Thanks
round.
for judging.
My pleasure.